Engine assembly. Installation of cylinder liner, crankshaft, piston connecting rod assembly. Common tools include sleeve tool, torque wrench, magnetic stand, dial indicator. Special tools include cylinder liner puller, piston ring compressor, connecting rod guide pin. Auxiliary materials include clearing agent, sealant. Clean the cylinder liner seat hole with a cleaning agent. Apply clean engine oil to the O-ring seal of the cylinder liner and install it on the cylinder liner. Attention, do not confuse the yellow and black sealing rings. The yellow sealing ring is located on the upper part of the cylinder liner. The black sealing ring is located below the cylinder liner. Apply clean engine oil to the outer diameter of the cylinder liner. Use a cylinder liner puller to insert the cylinder sleeve into the cylinder block. Tip: until the cylinder liner no longer moves inward. At this point, the cylinder liner is installed in place. Remove the cylinder liner puller. Install other cylinder liners using the same procedure. Measure the protrusion of the cylinder liner. Using a dial gauge, measure the cylinder liner protrusion at 4.90 degrees apart on the upper surface of the cylinder liner. Cylinder liner height 0.075 mm to 0.165 mm. Clean the cylinder block. Use a shovel to clean the surface of the cylinder body. Use cleaning agents to clean the inside of the cylinder block and all passages. Install upper bearing shells into each main bearing hole of the machine body. Attention when installing the bearing shell onto the bearing seat. Make sure that the bearing shell has enough bounce out. If there is insufficient or no bounce, replace the bearing shell. The upper and lower bearing shells of the main bearing are not interchangeable. If the shells are not replaced, they must be reinstalled in their original positions according to the markings made during disassembly. Apply engine oil to each tile. Use lifting tools to correctly seat the crankshaft into the shaft hole. Clean the thrust plate. Apply engine oil on one side of the oil tank. Install thrust plates on the 6th main journal. Attention, the oil groove on one side of the thrust plate is facing the crankshaft. Clean the main bearing cover, lower bearing shell and main bearing cover bolts. Install the lower bearing shell. Apply clean engine oil to the inner surface of the lower bearing shell. Install the main bearing cap back into its original position according to the position markings made during disassembly. Align the ring locating pin of the main bearing cover with the cylinder block. Install the two main bearing bolts and pre-tighten them by hand first. Repeat the above steps to install the remaining main bearing caps. Gently tap the main bearing cover into place with a rubber hammer. Alternately pre-tighten the main bearing cover bolts. After tightening the bolts, tighten them in the order shown in the diagram from the middle to both sides. The first step 160 Nm. Step to turn 180 degree. Check if the crankshaft rotates freely. Tip: when the crankshaft is not rotating flexibly, it needs to be removed for inspection. Check if the tile covers are installed in series. Is there any damage to the crankshaft bearing seat hole? Is there any damage to the threads of the bearing cover bolt holes? Check if the bolt seat hole is dirty. Is the crankshaft bent? Measure the axial clearance of the crankshaft. Install a magnetic gauge holder and a dial gauge on the cylinder block. Push the contact of the dial gauge onto the crankshaft and face. Pry the crankshaft forward and hold it still. Set the dial gauge to 0. Pry the crankshaft back and hold it still. The reading on the dial gauge is the axial clearance value of the crankshaft. The gap value is 0.175 mm to 0.425 mm. Install the piston connecting rod assembly. Clean the piston and connecting rod components with clean gasoline. Turning the crankshaft, place the connecting rod journal to be installed at the bottom dead center. Apply a layer of clean lubricating oil to the cylinder liner. Apply lubricating oil to the inner side of the bearing shell on the connecting rod. Install the assembled cylinder piston connecting rod assembly into the cylinder. The arrow at the top of the piston points towards the front of the engine. Install in situ according to the markings made during disassembly, and apply clean lubricating oil to the piston rings. Rotating piston rings. Confirm that the piston ring rotates freely in the groove. Correctly arrange the opening position of the piston rings. Space the opening positions of each ring 120 degree, using a piston ring compressor to compress the piston rings. Installing guide pins. Use a nylon rod to push the piston until the top of the piston is completely pressed into the cylinder liner. Attention: if the piston cannot be installed smoothly, it needs to be removed and the piston rings checked for breakage or damage. Remove the guide pin. Use clean lubricating oil. Lubricating the mating surface between the bearing shell and the crankshaft journal. Attention: before installing the large end cap of the connecting rod, it is necessary to check and confirm that the end cap number and the connecting rod body number are consistent. Installing connecting rod cap. Confirm installation with the protrusion facing backwards. Alternately pre-tighten the two connecting rod bolts, and then tighten them in 2 steps after pre-tightening is completed. Step 1. Apply the torque to 85 Nm. Step 2. Rotate at a 60-degree angle. Check the connecting rod. Shake the connecting rod big and axially by hand. It is suitable for the large end to move slightly. Attention, if it cannot move freely, the piston connecting rod assembly must be removed for inspection. Is the clearance between the bearing shells normal? Is there any damage to the bearing seat hole? Whether the connecting rod is bent, etc. Turning the crankshaft. Confirm that the crankshaft is running normally. Attention! After completing the installation of each piston connecting rod group, rotate the crankshaft for inspection. If excessive rotational resistance is found or the crankshaft cannot rotate at all, the piston connecting rod assembly needs to be removed to identify the cause. Repeat the above steps. Install piston and connecting rod components for other cylinders. Clean the cooling nozzle and bolts with clean gasoline. Rotate the crankshaft to the appropriate position. Align the installation of the piston cooling nozzle and the bolts. Tightening torque 28 Nm. Rotate the crankshaft to complete the installation of other cylinder nozzles. Attention, if the nozzle falls or deforms, it needs to be replaced directly.